right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join today. I apologize, and I'm terribly disappointed that I can't be there with you in person, and I apologize for the sound of my voice. Unfortunately, I am at home trying to recover from the flu. Excuse me. So I appreciate the assistance with some technical difficulties early on. I'm very thrilled to be able to have been present today, virtually, of course, and be able to still present on the rise of female warfighter in all environments. We're going to kind of take a little bit of a spin off of Holly's presentation where she really talked us through kind of what the elite female warfighter looks like now. And I'm going to take an environmental spin because oftentimes, as everyone in the room is aware, our warfighters can be, excuse me, sometimes need to deploy rapidly, perform very arduous tasks in these extreme environments, or be deployed for long extended periods of time in these arduous environments, in these austere environments. So that's the role that we're going to be looking at today. Next slide, please. So the first thing that I would like to discuss, and actually to follow up on the point that Dr. Friedel made so eloquently, is that women are still underrepresented in research. This is across all biomedical research. We have been doing better in the last couple of decades, but we are still very underrepresented, so much so that very recently the White House actually has an initiative for women in biomedical research, and the NIH has similar initiatives as well. But to really look at this through an environmental lens, this is an excellent systematic review that was published just a couple of years ago, looking at thermoregulation in research. And this still shows, and as of 2019, women made up less than 20% of all research volunteers in thermoregulatory research. So that's heat stress, cold stress. And that's not just in a military environment, whereas the military is 18% women. You could say, hey, you know what, that's approximately representative. This is all thermoregulatory research. So this is every physically active population. This is all NCAA, where women make up 50% or more of those populations. So we're still drastically underrepresented, and there's a lot that we don't know. And we can advance one slide for the animation. And this is really important because one of the things that we know, one, in the scientific community and in the athletic community and in the military community, we're making policies and recommendations to keep individuals safe. So in the academic community, it's the American College of Sports Medicine, the National Athletic Trainers Association. In athletics, it's the NCAA or the International Olympic Committee. In the military, it's technical bulletins for medical purposes, for policies and recommendations to keep people safe in austere environments and across the board with work to rest ratios, how long individuals can, how much fluid they should consume, and how hard they should be working depending on the flag condition. But unfortunately, because of this underrepresentation in research, most of these recommendations are based on data collected in men. Again, following up on a point that Dr. Friedel made earlier, and we can go to the next slide. And so one of the things that we know is that even still, some of the recommendations that we have are based on data that are collected in men and extrapolated for data in women, because we simply don't have enough data in women to say this is the responses of women. We can answer some of these questions on an isolated level, but in some instances we have dozens or hundreds of studies on very similar topics in men and less than a handful in women. And what we need is more data, if we can advance the slide, so that we can have recommendations appropriate for both men and women. Please don't take this presentation as a way to suggest that we should have separate recommendations for men and women, where here's a recommendation for men, separate recommendation for women. There's a way that we can, with enough data, we can have appropriate recommendations for both men and women. And we can advance one slide, please. Excuse me. But unfortunately, we do need more data to get to that point. And if we can go again to the next slide, I'll get to talk about really what the meat of my talk is supposed to be about, which is environmental stress. And so we're talking about heat stress, cold stress, hypoxia, and high altitude. There's also subterranean considerations for urban warfare, operating in tunnels, and then hydration considerations, which is not necessarily an environment in and of itself, but is very valuable and important. And with heat stress, one of the things that we know, particularly following up on some myths and misnomers, again, as Dr. Friedel mentioned, women were oftentimes thought to be at an increased risk for exertional heat stroke, which is the most severe form of heat illness. And that's just simply not the case. So we have some very recent data actually out of Usarium looking at a population level analysis on exertional heat stroke across the entire Army from 2016 to 2021 that showed that sex was not a risk factor at all. Women were at an increased risk over men, men were not at an increased risk over women. Now, we do know that women do engage in behavioral traits that might do them a better service exercising in the heat. This is also true for hydration. We see this in road race style events where women are consuming more fluid and they're actually pacing themselves better, even if they're still PRing relative to their male counterparts. And so this is a possible behavioral advantage. But from a physiological perspective, thermoregulation, exercising in the heat, there is no reason to believe that women are at an increased risk for the most fatal form of heat illness. Now, that doesn't mean we know how what the differences are in the way men and women adapt. We know that there are differences in thermoregulation. We know that there are differences across the menstrual cycle for women in thermoregulation, but again, no apparent increase in risk there. With cold stress, this is where we really have the least amount of research on women. We know that women have a higher incidence of Raynaud's phenomenon from a clinical perspective, which is actually a decrease in blood flow to the extremities, which we also know a decrease in blood flow to the extremities can lead to an increase in freezing cold injuries. But again, there has not been that link of data there to suggest that women are at an increased risk with that. In hypoxia and high altitude, this is actually, excuse me again, this is actually the area with the most conflicting research, where in some instances we'll see that some data shows that women have a higher prevalence of acute mountain sickness versus men having a higher prevalence. Women have less severity of acute mountain sickness. Again, a lot of this could be tied back to behavioral traits. But something to keep in mind is that we do need, again, a lot of more research. And then if we can advance one slide, please, for the animation. One of the things that we have to address and we have to understand is that of the research that we have, some of it limits women to the early follicular phase of the menstrual cycle, which even in the same woman may not be representative of where she is in the mid-luteal phase or if she takes contraceptives. So we have to understand that the influence of female sex hormones while trying to maintain external validity and practicality, we have to understand that those do make an impact, and we have to know that women in research in the early follicular phase do not represent all women. Whether or not they're menstruating, because there's menstrual dysfunction, as has been mentioned earlier today with amenorrhea, very prevalent in the warfighter community, and sometimes they're menstruating, but they're not ovulating. And so there are different levels of menstrual dysfunction that are occurring, whether or not they're using contraceptives, because this contraceptive use does impact the way they respond to in extreme environments. If they're pregnant, how far they are from being postpartum and they're pregnant, or even in perimenopause. So there are several different factors here, and we need boatloads of more research in women to really understand how women perform and how best to keep them safe and healthy and optimally performing in these extreme environments. And with that, largely for the sake of my voice, we can advance to the next slide and I can take any and all questions.